Most new things are criticized, sometimes even rightly so. Things like video games raised many discussions and questions in their time. People began blaming truly terrible acts on simple entertainment, forgetting whose hands held the tool of the deed. The city of Wellington in the U.S. state of Ohio, not far from Cleveland, is a small town with about 5,000 inhabitants. It is known as a quiet and peaceful place, ideal for people seeking solitude, raising children, or simply wanting to start anew. There are practically no sights here apart from the picturesque landscape. Life moves extremely slowly. This is naturally good for the older generation who decided to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. But for young people, there is practically nothing to do here. As a rule, as they get older, they leave their parents' homes and move to larger cities to pursue an education, build a career, and establish a life. Then the cycle repeats itself, roughly following the same pattern. The Petrick family lived in Wellington, consisting of 43-year-old Susan, her husband Mark, their two daughters Heidi and Holly, and their youngest son Daniel. They were a typical suburban family. At the time of the tragic events, the couple had been married for about years. The mother of the family, Susan, was born and raised in a similar town in the state of Maryland. From an early age, she dreamed of having a family, but she knew that she had to work hard for it and first stand on her own 2 feet. That's why she diligently studied at a college in Pennsylvania in her youth. That's where she met Mark. The young couple fell in love at first sight and were inseparable ever since. When their college days came to an end, they moved to Wellington. After graduation, Susan became a nurse. For her, this was a great achievement, as she had always dreamed of it. After the move, she quickly found a job at Wellington Hospital. Mark became a clergyman. Here he was able to become a pastor at the local church and was highly respected throughout the area. The family's children grew up in a Christian environment where faith was highly valued. From an early age, the daughters and the son were surrounded by care and love. Daniel Petrick was a teenager. At the time of the events, he was going through a transitional phase, which had a significant impact on his relationships with his family members. He was born on August 24, 1991. Family and friends described him as a completely normal teenager who was quite communicative, friendly, and courteous in every situation. The Bible was not just empty words to him, which was naturally related to the traditions of the Petrick family. The young man was never confrontational and avoided trouble. During his school days, he was described as a confident, average student. He didn't stand out particularly from the other children, but he was certainly no worse than the others. He always avoided trouble and had no problems with the law. He was not a teenager who constantly caused problems. Even his rebellious phase, as it turned out, was quieter than that of many of his peers. He had good grades and big plans for the future. This seemed quite realistic given life in a small American province, where teenagers can quickly become bored. The boy quickly found distraction in computer games. This brightened his everyday life, although he became too lost in them. After transitioning to high school, he became seriously interested in sports and led an active lifestyle, so his new passion did not seem alarming. However, in the winter when he was 10 years old, he injured his spine in a skiing accident with his parents. From then on, Daniel was bedridden. During this time, he spent most of his time either in front of the TV or playing video games, to which he had become seriously addicted. Quite by chance, Mark noticed the high level of violence in his son's games. He feared that this entertainment might have a bad influence on Daniel. By 2007, Mark was finally convinced that such things were harmful to the growing generation. Furthermore, he noticed a real addiction in Daniel. He spent all his free time on his new hobby and became nervous when he couldn't play. In 2007, this industry was not yet so developed that older people could deal with it appropriately. They were very concerned. Opinions differed. Daniel's relatives considered it a bad thing. Mark wanted to keep the teenager away from it. The parents took complete control of Daniel's leisure activities. They analyzed every video game he wanted to play. As a rule, everything was rejected due to the high depiction of violence, the numerous bloody scenes, and the aggression. This fate also befell the game GTA, which Daniel started playing at the age of 15. His mother and father did not want it to be played in their house. Consequently, the student was even forced to go to his friend's house to secretly play what he liked. In 2007, a game called Halo gained popularity, which greatly interested Daniel and his friends. In the year of its release, it quickly topped the charts. No wonder the 16-year-old teenager wanted to keep up with his friends in the gaming industry. His parents tried the game again and were once again dissatisfied. Mark found the game far too brutal. A real confrontation arose between the parents and their son. As with the teenager's previous decision, the father rejected Halo and forbade playing the game in the house. Daniel had to go to his friend's house again to play, but Mark accidentally found out what the two were doing and wanted to control those visits too. The more pressure was put on Daniel, the more he resisted. The internal tension continued to grow within the Petrick family. In October 2007, Daniel could no longer resist his urge to play despite the bans. One day he approached his father and asked him to buy him a CD so he could entertain himself. The religious man refused under the same pretext. It was too brutal and bloody a game that could damage the psyche. The dialogue escalated into a conflict. Daniel had a tantrum. At this point, he was playing at least 8 hours a day, which was one of the reasons for the disagreements with the older generation. Seeing his son's inappropriate behavior, Mark again lost his temper and issued an ultimatum. He told the student that if he didn't stop playing Halo, he would have to move out. The impulsive teenager chose the first option. He moved in with a friend for a few days. The new life initially seemed like heaven on earth to Daniel. However, this state did not last long. The teenagers played up to 18 hours a day. Even his friend's parents were worried and asked him to play less and for Daniel to return home because of possible unrest in the family. In their opinion, it was Daniel who provoked the endless gaming and drew their son into the addiction. The gamer returned home, but that could not resolve the tensions in the family. Mark continued to insist that he stop playing video games, especially Halo, but his son had no intention of listening. Shortly after the boy returned to his parental home, he stole money, secretly escaped through the window, and bought the CD of the game Halo 3, which his father had forbidden him to have. The teenager knew that this action could cause him problems, but secretly hoped to play. Of course, Daniel was quickly discovered, which was the final straw. Mark confiscated the game console and locked it in the family safe. He kept it there where his pistol and ammunition also lay. The man had bought the weapon a long time ago for self-defense in case of a robbery. Only he had the key, which he kept in a secret place that Daniel did not know about. Against this background, the student naturally had real tantrums and fits of hysteria. Mark planned to deal with these problems in the coming days. Daniel's gaming addiction had clearly gotten out of control, which is why the father began seeking advice and looking for a specialist who could help his son with his gaming addiction. Saturday, October 20, 2007, was a completely normal day for the Petrick family. The long-awaited weekend was finally here. That Saturday, they planned to go shopping at the supermarket and then go to a cafe. The parents, Mark and Susan, hoped this would help re-establish contact with their son and simply enjoyed the free time before the outing. The elder daughter, Heidi, was spending time with friends and her husband. She promised to come home with them in the evening. The younger daughter was studying at the university and living separately. After lunch, Daniel's parents were sitting in the living room watching television. Suddenly, he came into the room and stood in front of them. The boy seemed very agitated and said he had a present for Mom and Dad, therefore they should close their eyes. The teenager had not spoken to them at all in the last few days. Therefore, his mother and father were very surprised by his behavior and the gift. They decided to play along and closed their eyes. A few seconds of agonizing anticipation passed when Mark heard a familiar metallic clinking. As it turned out, Daniel had spent the last few days desperately searching for the key to his father's safe, which would allow him to retrieve his beloved game. When he finally found it, he discovered something else. Next to the CD, right in front of him, lay a pistol with cartridges. When Mark heard the familiar metallic sound, he opened his eyes and saw his wife being shot. The man could not believe that his son could do such a thing. Then a shot rang out, and the pastor was hit in the back of the head. The perpetrator's mother didn't have time to react to the noise. She was immediately hit by 4 bullets as her son stood behind her. The woman fell to the floor, barely having moved from the sofa. By chance, a few minutes later, the juvenile perpetrator's older sister came home with her husband. Heidi knocked on the door and her brother opened it, but he looked strange. He stood in the hallway and let no one inside. She tried to understand what was wrong with Daniel. He replied that there had been a fight with his parents and that they should better leave the house so they could reconcile. Heidi called out for her parents, but there was no answer. Then she tried to get past her brother into the house, but he clung to the door and visibly became angry. Through a stroke of luck, her father survived. The bullet got stuck in his skull and miraculously caused no fatal injuries. While Heidi was trying to find out from Daniel why he wouldn't let her into their parents' house, a blood-curdling scream echoed from behind the teenager's back. With all his strength, Mark clenched his fist and called for help. Heidi pushed her brother aside and looked into the living room where she saw the full horror. Her mother had been shot and lay lifeless in a pool of blood. Her father was still sitting on the sofa. His face was disfigured and the furniture, floor, and walls were splattered with blood. When Daniel realized he had been discovered, he pulled his father's pistol from his breast pocket and took a step toward Heidi. Fortunately, her husband reacted quickly enough. He snatched the weapon from the teenager, who then fled. Amazingly, after all these events, Daniel left the parental home with the disc of Halo 3 in his hand. However, Heidi remained composed and reacted instantly. She grabbed the phone and immediately called the emergency services 911. She said that her brother had shot their parents. She pleaded for haste as her mother was no longer showing any signs of life and her father was still conscious but seriously injured. Paramedics and police officers arrived at the scene. They determined the death of the 43-year-old woman. Mark was still fighting for his life. Daniel was neither in the house nor nearby. A search for him was immediately launched. First, the gamer went to his neighborhood friend's house to play. To his disappointment, his buddy was not home. Daniel had not thought through the consequences of his actions, so he couldn't even hide and play his favorite game. He was arrested around time missing in source when he was simply loitering in the area trying to find one of his friends who had a free console. When the perpetrator was arrested, he behaved very nervously and did not cooperate with the police. Daniel insisted that he had not shot his relatives and started talking about the robber. But this version sounded unbelievable from the start, given the testimony of his sister who had actually caught him at the scene. Then the minor murderer changed his story. Now he claimed that his father had attacked first and he had shot in self-defense. He described his father, the pastor, as a brutal tyrant who had terrorized all family members for years. This is how Daniel attempted to justify his terrible deed. He simply wanted to shift the blame for what happened onto his father. Verifying this was certainly not difficult but required additional time. Heidi refuted this statement. While Daniel spoke with the investigators, his father was in the hospital. He survived the attack. Now the doctors were doing everything in their power to ensure he survived the night. The perpetrator's mother ended up on the medical examiner's table. As it turned out, she had dodged the first bullet from the revolver. It only grazed her. The second hit her in the chest, the third in the right arm, and the last shot was fatal. Susan was shot in the head like her husband, but had significantly less luck. She did not survive the attack and died instantly from her injuries. The situation remained critical. The doctors did everything to save Mark. The man lost consciousness and fell into a coma right on the operating table. At the same time, Daniel was in the interrogation room. His statement was carefully checked by investigators. Of course, it was not difficult for the experienced investigators to recognize the 16-year-old's lies. Soon after, Daniel gave a new version of events on record. According to the teenager, on the day of the tragedy, he was in his room while his father walked through the apartment, loudly arguing with his wife. At some point, Daniel noticed that his father was walking quickly toward his study. After the pastor left the room, several shots were fired. The teenager was shocked. He left his room. His mother lay on the floor, riddled with bullets. The student stood still, frozen in shock, while Mark meanwhile pointed the weapon at his son. But according to Daniel, he spared him at the last moment and shot himself in the head. Apparently, he became aware of the gravity of his actions. Naturally, no one believed this new story either. The boy was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, and tampering with evidence. It would have been more difficult to disprove the teenager's lie if not for one circumstance. Mark lay in a coma for 2 weeks and finally regained consciousness. Miraculously, the man escaped death from a gunshot wound to the head. He paid a high price for his attempt to protect his son from brutality. He lost almost all bodily functions and had to learn to walk again. Furthermore, his memory returned only slowly. Mark was shot in the back of the head, but the bullet did not penetrate his brain. Instead, it went through his skull, shattered his jaw, severely injured his scalp, but hit neither his brain nor his cervical spine. It was only thanks to this fact that the pastor had the opportunity to rehabilitate. Recovery after 2 weeks in a coma took 1 month. Subsequently, 5 major facial surgeries were required. During this time, the man suffered from a very severe post-traumatic stress disorder and even constantly trembled. Nevertheless, he gradually managed to regain his health and his usual abilities. Mark practically experienced his wife's death twice. The worst part for Mark was when he remembered the events in detail. The consequences of his injury will stay with him for the rest of his life. At least that was the doctor's prognosis. Even today, he still has difficulty with some simple physical movements and continues to suffer emotionally. However, it was not the time to give up and fall into depression. The police officers were determined to obtain justice. The man who had miraculously survived the attack was the most important key to solving the crime. He was in a severe emotional crisis, which only worsened the situation, which is why the doctors recommended giving him a little more time. Soon he composed himself and was able to speak with the investigators. Mark recounted that he had even thought about killing his son, but since he was a church pastor, this method seemed unacceptable to him. Then the widower turned to God for help. Eventually, he managed to forgive his misguided son. That took a long time, and during that time, the man repeatedly quoted a sentence from the Bible. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This became a kind of mantra that gradually helped him forgive Daniel. The entire Petrick family needed a long time for this, but even the sisters admitted that they no longer held a grudge against their brother. The reason for the shooting of his parents, namely the game Halo 3, sparked great public interest. People condemned the violence in video games as many parents were worried about their children. Could such an outburst of violence not happen to them too? The possible influence of such games on young people seemed undeniable to some. Ultimately, without looking into it further, people blamed the game and the developers for Daniel taking up the weapon. All of this triggered fierce debates in society. Even the preliminary hearings were very intense and emotional. The relatives had already processed their grief and anger at this point and wanted to show with all their might that they accepted the situation and wanted to close this case as quickly as possible. The murderer, for his part, showed remorse and complained that he missed his mother. Although he cried almost continuously throughout the entire trial, the prosecution insisted that the defendant was only trying to deceive everyone and did not actually feel remorse. From the beginning, Mark was the most damaged party. The man had to undergo several serious operations. The consequences of the injuries sustained will haunt him throughout his life. He lost his wife, almost lost his son, and even almost lost his faith. Only his faith, as he himself admits, saved him. By turning to God, he managed to get himself back under control. He put aside his hatred and his desire to kill Daniel. Instead, the father visited his son every weekend while he awaited trial for murder and attempted murder. Mark even believed that his son felt remorse. The murderer himself stated this repeatedly and regretted that his mother could not be brought back. When the trial came, Daniel surprisingly waived his right to a jury trial, despite his lawyer's advice. The young man decided to leave his fate to a single judge. He considered this just as the judge was the only person who had decided his mother's fate. The only thing that eased Mark's pain was the state law. He was not allowed to lose his son. It was decided to convict him as a minor. Thanks to this regulation, the maximum penalty was not imposed on Daniel. However, he risked a life sentence with the possibility of early release on parole. At the trial, the defense lawyers tried from the outset to clear the young man, citing the gaming and the game console as the cause of his problems. They insisted that he had no history of violence and that his strong attachment to video games was due to a spinal injury from which he had recovered at home for a long time. The lawyers tried to evoke sympathy by pointing out that their client had to sit at home for a very long time and could practically not go outside. Of course, the teenager had to occupy himself somehow. He found solace in video games, which, however, turned out to be a real evil for him. However, the prosecution insisted that it was a cold-blooded attempt to kill his relatives. Mark narrowly escaped death, and his older sister could have been the third victim if her husband had not intervened. He was lucky that Heidi's husband was standing behind the teenager and was able to react quickly to take the weapon away from him. Otherwise, there could have been 4 victims. According to the prosecution, unintentional actions were ruled out. On the contrary, the prosecution emphasized that Daniel had used cunning and lulled his parents into a false sense of security to prevent them from escaping the shooting. He had been planning the murder for about a week. After murdering his mother and wounding his father, the student had no intention of calling for help. Mark recalled, after recovering from his injuries, how his son had pressed the pistol into his hand. The pastor could barely move, but he was still conscious and understood that Daniel wanted to stage a murder and a voluntary departure into the afterlife. Against this background, the direction of the shot naturally seemed ill-considered, as Mark could under no circumstances have shot himself in the back of the head. Apparently, the perpetrator wanted to stage a scene. He would have succeeded if his older sister hadn't come home earlier than promised. That is why he took his father's pistol and opened the door. Unfortunately, Daniel declined to comment on his plans in case everything had gone according to plan. The lawyers believed that all of this was speculation and that the staging had not been intentional. In 2007, the topic of video games became quite explosive against the backdrop of this crime. A major problem was the attitude and stance of people who were very ambivalent about this type of leisure activity. The format of Halo 3 was relatively new. The older generation knew nothing about it, which led to clearly biased and overly emotional interpretations. Parents feared for their children, and cases of addiction and tantrums only added fuel to the fire. The case of Daniel Petrick was significant in many ways. It is still actively used today by opponents of the gaming industry. When the hearings began, the judge's opinion was clear and radical. The child was clearly under the influence of his preferences and his leisure activities, similar to alcohol or banned substances. This resulted in him no longer being able to distinguish between game and reality. Daniel picked up a weapon, wrongly believing that he could kill his relatives without consequence. They would simply respawn in the next round. The judge insisted that video games, similar to hard substances, destroy a teenager's soul and body. This resonated greatly with concerned parents and also with the survivor, Mark. However, this categorical stance was later repeatedly criticized. Despite decades of research, there is still no scientific evidence linking video games to real-world violence. By no means do all murderers enjoy gaming. Just as by no means do all gamers pick up weapons. There is no clear link between the two. At the hearings, Mark and Susan had the impression that too much attention was being paid to the gaming industry. It seemed as if everyone had forgotten that none of the developers had placed a weapon in the teenager's hand and forced him to lie to his parents so they couldn't escape the bullets. At some point, it even became absurd. The prosecution claimed that Daniel had intensively trained shooting with Halo 3 for several months. He had mentally prepared for the execution, as he had planned to kill his parents the entire time. The judge remained convinced that video games can trigger reactions similar to banned substances and can even lead to severe psychological problems. As expected, the 17-year-old was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. He must spend 23 years in prison before he is eligible for early release. If he has no disciplinary problems, his chances of convincing the commission are good. Daniel Petrick will be 40 years old when he is finally released. After the trial, the teenager was transferred to Mansfield Prison, 40 km from Wellington. He is currently still there. He will not be eligible for release until 2030. Mark has completed a long road to recovery after the events. Eventually, he was able to remarry. Today, he fondly remembers Susan, often asking himself if he could have changed something. His father continues to visit Daniel regularly in prison. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.